Good afternoon, everyone, and everybody who'll be watching from far away. We come now to session 33 of the Bible story, the story of Antipater and King Herod the Great. These are the people in whose time all the scene is set for the New Testament era, which we shall come to next time. But in the last session, we followed the fortunes of the upstart Hasmonean family, who took over the roles of both high priest and king, following the successes of their forebears, the Maccabees. They had rebelled successfully against the religious persecution inflicted on them by Syria. Their forceful and influential queen, Salome Alexandra, had died in 67 BCE, leaving two sons, Hyrcanus II, a gentle person who was happy to be high priest and allow his younger brother, more forceful brother, Aristobulus, to be the king. All might have been well, but for an upstart on the scene by the name of Antipater. He was the son of Antipas, the governor of Idumea in the south. Antipater was a man of ambition. He was only a second-generation Jew, having been forcefully circumcised when younger, but he was determined to rise to the top by backing the legitimate elder son, Hyrcanus, to be king, rather than Aristobulus. Thereby, of course, he would be the power behind the throne. He was crafty, manipulative, and had wealthy friends. His intrigues began when he persuaded Hyrcanus to enlist the help of King Aretas of the Nabateans in the far south. It was a successful move, apart from the price, the return of 12 conquered cities. Well, then Aretas and his army backed Hyrcanus and Antipater, fought Aristobulus, and won. The defeated Aristobulus escaped to Jerusalem and hid in the temple during the Passover festival, thanks to the help of the Sadducees. The year was 65, only 2 years after Salome's death. And this was the beginning of Rome's offensive in the area. And the Jews became a political football for the next 2 years. The Roman general Pompey had ambitions to extend Rome's domination over Syria. Let's have some pictures. That's Antipater. Thought well of himself in the centre of that facade. And we come to the Roman general Pompey. He had ambitions to extend Rome's domination over Syria and gain access to all the lands west of the river Euphrates. He arrived in Damascus in 64, and what remained of the Syrian regime merely collapsed. Before going east, however, Pompey realized that the Jewish situation could become a nuisance to his plans. So he sent the new subordinate governor of Syria, Scaurus, to Jerusalem to sort out the Jewish situation. Once there, Scaurus was met by 2 delegations, each pleading their case. Well, Aristobulus must have offered the bigger bribe, because Scaurus decided in his favour rather than Hyrcanus and Antipater. He ordered Aretas to go home or be considered an enemy of Rome. Well, Aretas went very quickly. Aristobulus was confirmed as king and chased after Aretas and won a crushing defeat over his retreating army. Then 3 delegations of Jews went to Pompey in Damascus. Hyrcanus and Antipater, and Aristobulus, as expected, but also a separate delegation from the Pharisees, who asked Pompey to get rid of all the Hasmonean rulers and allowed the Jews once more to be ruled by their high priest. Pompey delayed his answer, and the impatient Aristobulus set off home to seize power for himself, a big mistake. The Romans pursued him, overtook him, and he submitted, offering them gifts and money. But when they all arrived at Jerusalem, the gates were locked against them. Aristobulus and the Sadducees were determined to hold out and resist within the temple area. But the situation was diffused by Hyrcanus and Antipater, who opened the city gates and invited the Romans in. Wow. The Sadducees held out for 3 months in the temple before the wall was breached, and then many were slaughtered, including the priests who were offering a sacrifice at the altar. Aristobulus was arrested, and then Pompey scandalized all the Jews by entering the temple himself, and even the Holy of Holies, which was empty, of course. He didn't plunder anything, but he was never, ever forgiven, even though he gave orders next day that the temple should be returned to its customary use. Pompey now gave the orders. Hyrcanus and Antipater was reinstated, not as king, but as ethnarch, while Scaurus in Damascus would ensure that good order prevailed throughout Judea. Poor Aristobulus and all his family were taken to Rome, where in 61 he was humiliated and forced to walk in Pompey's victory procession through the streets as one of the spoils of war. Well, Antipater virtually ruled over the Jews, officially for Hyrcanus, but actually for Rome. When Aristobulus eventually escaped with his younger son from Rome in 56 and started to make more trouble in Judea, Antipater beat them and returned them to Rome. Friends with Rome, yes, but he could not prevent the new proconsul in Syria from coming to Jerusalem and helping himself to the temple's treasure. By this time, Pompey was in decline, being overtaken by Julius Caesar. Now, I know this is Roman history, but the Jews' history is all wrapped up in what was going on in the Roman area. And we come to Julius Caesar, taking over from the declining Pompey. He did no more than release Aristobulus from Rome, gave him soldiers and orders to fight Pompey's supporters in Syria. But Aristobulus was poisoned and his elder son executed by Pompey's supporters before he could even set off from Rome. 49 BCE. Caesar was hounding Pompey, who was murdered when he arrived in Egypt. Antipater immediately ordered all Jews in Judea to support Julius Caesar, thus ensuring Caesar's success and his gratitude. Julius Caesar's gratitude was magnanimous. He went to Syria and made a very generous settlement with the Jews. Antipater himself was made a citizen of Rome and exempted from paying any taxes. He was also recognized as procurator, or the Roman authority in Judea, owing personal responsibility to Caesar himself. Furthermore, he gave permission for the temple walls to be rebuilt in Jerusalem and promised the Jews freedom to follow their own unique religion, not only in Judea, but also in the diaspora. And remember, it was all about who you worshipped. And the Roman people were worshipping one leader after another, all the Roman gods. The Jews were exempted from all that. A very generous gesture from Caesar. But even more than this, Caesar acknowledged the sanctity of the weekly Sabbath for Jews and decreed that they would never be required to serve in the Roman army because of the Sabbath regulations, and they would not be able to fight. What generous terms for Rome's friends, and all should have been well. But only 3 years later, in 44 BC, Julius Caesar was murdered in Rome and very sadly mourned by the Jews. Oh, sorry. In his new role, Antipater, oh no, I haven't got to him yet. In his new role, Antipater was able to appoint his son Phanuel as governor of Jerusalem and his younger son Herod as administrator of Galilee. So we're introducing the murder of Julius Caesar. And now the young Herod. Herod soon showed his potential. When the Galileans rose up against him, he crushed them with such great severity that he was never ever forgiven by the Jews. Enough of him for the moment. Well, there was great confusion in Rome following Caesar's murder, and I expect you know all this, but the confusion involved the Jews among many others. Caesar's nephew Octavian and his friend Mark Antony set out to avenge Julius's death, and someone unknown managed to murder Antipater in Judea. Herod avenged his father and assumed his father's position of leadership in Judea. But Antigonus opposed him and again made a bid for the throne himself. Herod crushed him, and he married Mariamne. If you look on the time chart I gave you a couple of sessions ago, you'll see that she was the granddaughter of Hyrcanus II, that aged weakling high priest, ethnarch. So thus somewhat Herod was trying to legitimize his position as at the head of the Jews. Meanwhile, Caesar's murderers, Brutus and Cassius, were defeated at Philippi and both committed suicide. Octavian and Mark Antony took charge and shared the responsibility. Octavian took Rome and the West, and Mark Antony the eastern parts of their growing territories. Don't know if we've got a map. Yes. You see there the Empire of Rome. You find Italy in the middle, sticking out of into the Mediterranean Sea. Italy and all things west were under Octavian's influence from Rome, while Mark Antony took over the eastern part from Greece, Turkey, Egypt, and Jerusalem, Syria, and so on. So it was a clear division halfway through the Mediterranean Sea. Herod wasted no time. He sent lavish gifts, receiving in return from Mark Antony confirmation of his position in Judea, and completely sidelining Hyrcanus this time. So now it's Antipater it's Herod and not Hyrcanus. Only 2 years later, however, Antigonus saw another opportunity to assert himself and his claim to the throne of Judea when Antony fell under the spell of Queen Cleopatra in Egypt and lost interest in Judea as well as almost everything else. And there she is, beautiful, alluring Queen Cleopatra. Well, Antigonus bribed Rome's enemies, the Parthians, to help. And they succeeded. Hyrcanus was captured, his ears cut off, so he couldn't be high priest anymore, and he was taken off to Babylon. Herod escaped with his family, first to the craggy mountaintop fortress at Masada, and then to Rome, while Antigonus II at last proclaimed himself king of Judea. All that in the year 40 BC. And 1 year later, Herod had been received by Antony and Cleopatra in Rome, where Antony spoke up for him and persuaded the Roman Senate to elect Herod to be king of the Jews. Not Judea, but the Jews. And that he was to be answerable directly to both Octavian and himself Antony. But back in Judea, Antigonus was now at last king. Let's have a picture of King Herod to keep us going. Herod, king of the Jews, thanks to Rome. Well, he wasted no time. He returned to Judea, raised an army, and took Galilee into his control. He rescued his family at Masada, and when help did arrive from Antony, he laid a 5-month siege around Jerusalem, which ended with the help of the Pharisees who surrendered the city. Herod was given permission to execute Antigonus, kill many of his friends, and levy a tax demand on the rich and wealthy who survived. Well, what about the ordinary people going on oblivious of all this political confusion? Well, they were fed up, to put it mildly. They had no liking for Herod, but were helpless. And a new movement began very quietly. They began to wish that God would act for them and send a new military Messiah. A Messiah means the anointed one, who would send a military Messiah who would rid them both of Herod and the Romans and establish the kingdom of David again, as of old. And of course, the use of the term Messiah, the anointed one, reminded them, many of the ordinary folk, of what they had learned from the rabbis of the history and teaching of the prophets. And the highly political and influential Psalms of Solomon were written at this time. They weren't written by Solomon, of course. That was the name attached to them to give them credibility. And the Psalms of Solomon were written at this time by this new movement. Psalm 3 describes the righteous people of God. And in verse 16 we read, "But they that fear the Lord shall rise to life eternal." So, this reflects the thinking of the Pharisees, who by that time believed firmly in life after death. So we've got Pharisee backing of this new movement. But the long Psalm 17, which I have given you as a handout, reflects their new hope. And I quote bits of it, because it goes on and on and on and on. I quote, "O Lord, thou art our King forever and ever, but we hope in God our deliverer. Thou, O Lord, didst choose David to be king over Israel, and swore to him touching his seed that should never his kingdom fail. O Lord, raise up to them their king, the son of David, that he may reign over Israel, that he may purge Jerusalem, making it as holy as of old. And there shall be no unrighteousness in his days in their midst, for all shall be holy, and their king the anointed of the Lord." And in the following psalm, in 18, I quote, "The day of choice, when he brings back his anointed, Blessed shall they be in those days. They shall see the goodness of the Lord, which he will perform for the generation that is to come. The Lord's anointed, in the fear of his God, in the spirit of wisdom, righteousness, and strength. May he direct every man in the works of righteousness, that he may establish them all before the Lord, a good generation, living in the fear of the Lord. Well, excerpts from Psalm 18 there. And all this begins to sound rather like the preaching of John the Baptist. No less. Back to the politics of the time. Herod, awarded the title Great by history, ruled for a very long time. In fact, just over 35 years, from 37 to 4 BC. He was a Jew by religion, but an Arab Idumean by race. He was Greek by cultural sympathy, a Roman citizen by political allegiance, and clever enough to keep his kingdom even in the turmoil as the Roman Republic gave way to become an empire, with only one autocratic ruler, Octavian. Or now, as we meet him, Octavian became Augustus Caesar, Emperor of Rome, the one and only autocratic ruler. Herod achieved this by giving lavish presents again and total loyalty to whoever was in power. He was ruthless and cruel to anyone who opposed him, and in his later years, fearful of even his own family, who might possibly by then be plotting against him. At first, however, Herod hoped to extend his own territories, but he was denied by Cleopatra, whose own dream was that Antony should regain for her all the lands that the Ptolemies had ruled over long ago. She was given the coastal towns, not Herod, during the 30s. Antony's priorities had changed, and Cleopatra was taking the political lead, with the result that his reputation was ruined in Rome. Octavian now opposed his friend Antony, who was by now trapped in Cleopatra's fleet acting off the coast of Greece. And in the battle that followed, there you are, you see the battle lines, the Romans sieging the fleet of Antony and Cleopatra. Well, in the battle that followed, Cleopatra escaped in her boat, only to be followed by Antony, who deserted the fleet and followed her. And then he was chased by Octavian. Herod suddenly saw his own predicament. Immediately, he went to meet Octavian at Rhodes, apologized, and promised to obey the new master of Rome as loyally as the previous one. Octavian recognized Herod as an ally. And while Antony and Cleopatra were committing suicide in 30 BCE, Herod was given more territories, making his jurisdiction as great again as it had been in the time of King Solomon. And he was left but ordered to guard Rome's frontiers. Octavian proclaimed himself Augustus Caesar, sole ruler of Rome, and Herod treated him with very great respect. But he failed still to win the hearts of his people, in spite of all the prosperity he was able to give them, when the plots against him were firmly subdued and peace prevailed for a lengthy period of time. Herod was an astute businessman who traded in copper from Cyprus, salt and spices from India, horses, and many other commodities from elsewhere, all of which were subject to import tax and export tax. And the Jews benefited from all of this. If not all of them became sufficiently wealthy to pay the required taxes to Rome without feeling the pinch. Oh, it was a very, very good time to live in Jerusalem. Herod used his wealth to build many towns and fortresses in every part of his jurisdiction, hence his title, the Great. History only gives that title to people who've been great builders, and Herod was certainly one of them. He ushered in years of full employment and prosperity for the Jews. He built a huge aqueduct to improve the irrigation system in the Jordan Valley, and he built what the Jews had never had before, a port on the Mediterranean coast, which he named Caesarea in honor of Augustus. And there it is, still is there, just like that. It was a fabulous place, with a newly constructed harbour deep out into the sea, with its own infrastructure as a city, including, and you can see it just to the right of the picture, just outside the walls, the huge amphitheatre, which is still there. Now remember, there were no hillsides in that part of the stretch of the coastline, so a false one had to be constructed for all the seats in the theatre. And there's the theatre. And it's still there today. And with a lot of people, I sat in that auditorium and heard one person standing in the middle, and he just sang a solo folk song, and everybody could hear each word he sang. It's a brilliant piece of architecture. And that's at Caesarea, built by Herod the Great. He was a patron of the arts, Greek style of course, and established quinquennial games for everybody's pleasure, with gymnasia, theatres, public baths there and in many of the new cities he founded. He built many fortresses, enlarging Masada. And also, to name only one, he built the new city of Herodion. So that's Masada. Have you heard the story of Masada? It's in the south, the other side of the Dead Sea, and that is on a mountaintop. And he built that fortress. It was almost impenetrable till the Romans came along, but not yet. He built Masada, and soon after he built the new city of Herodion. Now if you go to Bethlehem and look southwards, that's what you see. That hill, very, very tall one, with a flat top. And it's still a spectacular today in its ruins. There's ruins where you go climb to the top, and then you drop down into the original city. And the ruins are spectacular. And that's just one photograph of the marketplace in the middle of the city of Herodion. He added a theatre. I think we've finished that one. He added a theatre and 2 beautiful palaces in Jerusalem, but his biggest enterprise of all was to enlarge and rebuild the temple on a magnificent scale, with all the Greek architecture available, with all its beautiful white marble columns, porticos, and arcades. Well, to do this, he had to enlarge its platform at the top of the mountain, and the massive blocks of, well, let me show you the scale. That was the temple, the top of its hill, and he just had to build out and build a complete, huge platform on which to build the new temple. It was massive. And that's all at the top of the mountain, but the massive blocks of granite used for this are still there today, and are venerated by the Jews as the Western Wall, where every Jewish boy dreams of celebrating his bar mitzvah. And that wall was part of the basis on which the temple was built above it. Massive. It was still work in progress by the time Jesus was there, with his disciples admiring its beauty. There is a plan. You can see the arcades with all those beautiful white columns all the way around. More courts, court of women now, as well as the court of Gentiles. At its heart, the old temple site of the Holy of Holies and the altar of sacrifice. It was massive. If you go there today, you are still on that platform, extending out of the dome of the rock where the Holy of Holies used to stand, and all the courtyards and the arcades, many of them still there. But of course it's Muslim now. It was still work in progress by the time Jesus was there, with his disciples admiring its beauty. But when it was finally finished, let's have a look at it. Finally, it was finished in all its beauty. Jesus with his disciples was admiring its beauty, and when it was finished, sadly, only 8 years before it was all destroyed. It was the largest temple ever built in the Roman Empire. Herod took great care not to offend the priesthood during this work by employing only people from the priestly families to build the new Holy of Holies. And that's what it looked like. But he did offend them when he set up a replica of a Roman eagle over the arch gateway. He couldn't win. He still couldn't win with the hearts of the people who prospered so very well under his leadership. Eventually, Herod was ill for many years. Let's get rid of that. With intense physical pain, which led him to the brink of insanity at times. His rages were phenomenal, and his paranoia with his family led to him executing his wife Mariamne and 2 of his better sons just before he died. When a false rumor spread in Jerusalem that he had died, the Pharisees immediately rose up and tore down that eagle over the temple gateway, only to feel the full force of his anger afterwards, when the 2 leading rabbis, Judas and Matthias, were burned alive and many others executed. Well, after executing his favourite son only 5 days before he died, Herod remade his will again. He divided his territories between his 3 surviving lesser sons. Archelaus on the left was to have Judea. Herod Antipas in the middle was to have Galilee. And Philip all the land beyond the river Jordan. Sadly, none of these men were good rulers, and the future began to look bleak again. And Herod died eventually in 4 BC and was buried in great state in that hilltop town of Herodion. Well, Herod's death marked a big turn for the worse for all his people. All the building works came to a sudden standstill, apart from the unfinished temple. And for many, unemployment suddenly became their lot. They soon began to feel the pinch. They became much poorer, and then, of course, began to find that the Roman taxes were a very heavy burden, so much so that they began to resent paying them at all. And the future, I'm afraid, did not look good. So we leave it now, and we enter the next period of time in the 1st century AD. On Sunday, fortnight's time, the 30th of July, at 4:30. I hope to see you all then. Goodbye for now, and cheerio.